I will bless the Lord at all times. His praise shall continually be in my mouth. Oh, magnify the Lord with me. Let us exalt his name together. We are live again tonight. Tonight is our creative arts, it's our Black History program. And the speaker, her connection keeps getting lost. So I am hoping that things work out for her to come back on. So tonight we are still inspired to prevail. God wants us to prevail to prove that we are more powerful than our enemy. He wants us to overcome every single battle with increasing power and strength. He wants us to overcome everything. So I pray that tonight, as we celebrate our Black history, you know, man wants to make it 1 month out of a year, but we as a people are making history every single day, adding more and more to our already rich history, handed down from generation to generation. So I I really don't know what to do right now. Like I said, we're waiting for her to come back on. I'm just going to go ahead and introduce her and hopefully she'll come on. Oh, here she is. Hopefully it'll stay this time. Hi.
So, hi, how are you?
I was just getting ready to introduce you to our guests, those that'll be coming on, and hopefully things will stay on this time. So tonight, I am excited to introduce to you our wonderful guest that will teach us a little history lesson about our history. And I've known Risa for over, I think it has to be over 40
Over
years,
40 years.
maybe
Yes.
or more. Situations and times pulled us away from each other, but I thank God for his reconciliation.
Oh,
And
yes.
I'm so glad that she is here tonight with DMO Ministries and Creative Arts. So let me give you a little background about our guest. Dr. Risa Fausette is a full time tenured historian who specializes in urban history, African American history, and the formation of African diaspora. I think that's how you say it.
Mhm.
She is the author of Race, Migration, and Port City Radicalism, West Indian Longshoremen, and the Politics of Empire, 1880 to 1920, published by the University of Hawaii Press. Dr. Fausette has received an Excellence in Teaching Award from Binghamton University, a Ford Foundation research grant, and served as a Thurgood Marshall Fellow at Dartmouth University. At the College of St. Rose, she has served the Department of History and Political Science since 1999 as an associate professor, teaching courses in urban history, African American history, and the transatlantic slave trade. So help me to welcome our guest, Dr. Risa Fausette, tonight.
Oh, thank you for that beautiful introduction. And it warms my heart to be here. Minister Surgic, you'll always be Teresa to me, but Minister
Mhm.
Surgic, I'm so proud of your accomplishments in the work of the Lord, the number of souls, including mine, that you have
Mhm.
touched and shaped over the years. And I just pray that God will bless your footsteps every step of the
Mhm.
way. Um, I'm overjoyed to be here. And as I was saying earlier, I decided to talk about the Great Migration that is underway right now
Mhm.
in America. I'm sure that everyone listening probably knows someone or is related to someone who has moved out of a northern or midwestern state and
Mhm.
has either gone to the south or the southwest. And we are in the midst of one of the greatest migration reversals in Black history. and I want to talk about what that means. So I'll give my formal talk, and then afterwards, I'm hoping that you and I can just have a discussion
Yeah.
about what this means for all of us.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so to get started, the Great Migration was one of the most dramatic demographic shifts in modern American history. It was that shift that brought African Americans, who 90% of whom lived in the South, and changed us from being a Southern, mostly rural people to, by the year 1970, the majority of African Americans were now living in the North and the Midwest. And I'm going to ask Minister Surgery to put up the first map so we can see. And there we are. The map's up, and I'm still here. That's great. Okay. So between 1900 and 1970, millions of Southerners left the South, most going to the North and the Midwest. African Americans were trying to escape what Douglas Blackaman called the second slavery of sharecropping and convict leasing and debt peonage in the South, where many Black Americans were trapped in poverty and subject to sporadic episodes of mob and individual violence. The labor shortage during World War I really opened up the gates and provided opportunities for African Americans to seek work in steel mills, railroads, and factories. As the word spread about job opportunities, Black Southerners poured into the North, often with meager resources, to seek a new beginning in what the Chicago Defender newspaper called the Promised Land. Many of them came with images of equality and hopes for a new chance. And an estimated 5 million Black Southerners migrated in the first and second wave of this great migration. The second map shows you the second wave that occurred. This second wave occurred during the World War II
You want the next
period.
map up?
Yes. And this second wave, as you can see, African Americans were leaving the states that are shown in the red color, those southern states, and they were going to the states that are colored in the dark green, and to a lesser extent, the states that are colored in the light green. And this migration continued steadily right through the 1970s. Most of the African Americans that were coming out of the Florida, Carolinas, and Virginia, they would take the boats that came up the side of the Atlantic Ocean. We call those the coastwise boats. But for those who were coming from Arkansas, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, they tended to take the trains that ran right up the middle of the nation, and they usually ended up in places like Chicago, Cleveland, and Detroit. And then the Black Texans, they tended to migrate over towards California, especially in World War II, when the industries took off, especially aeronautics and everything related to shipbuilding. Like I said, by the time you got to the 1970s, 8 out of 10 Black residents lived in metropolitan areas outside of the South. Now, we know that right now, when we look back and study the Great Migration, that it was not only the pull of jobs, but it was also a hope for equality. African Americans in the South could not vote. Very few of them could vote. So they were politically disfranchised. They were subject to segregation laws and a lot of racial violence. However, when they got to the North, the Midwest, and even the Western states after World War II, what they found was it's not that Jim Crow disappeared, it just occurred in different forms. And in fact, some were shocked to find that there were many Northern and Midwestern states that were even more intensely segregated than the Southern states they had left. You would see African Americans being subject to restrictive covenants, and those are clauses that are written in property deeds that states that they can't buy homes in certain neighborhoods. And so in places like Chicago, 85% of Chicago was off limits to African Americans, even if they made enough money in the factories to be able to purchase their own homes. And then, starting in the 1930s, the federal government began promoting redlining as a way of valuing mortgages. And any area that was redlined was considered to be unstable, and the banks would not lend because the government would not guarantee the mortgages. And any place, any neighborhood that contained even a small amount of African Americans was redlined on these maps. So even African Americans that were successful, who ran their own businesses, the banks would not do business with them. They would not lend to them. And being denied mortgages and home ownership, this meant that for many decades, African Americans were not acquiring the wealth that other Americans were achieving, because they were able to buy homes in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s and watch those homes skyrocket in terms of their value, which created wealth that they could pass on to future generations. Despite all of the challenges, the discrimination in housing, the discrimination in jobs, and even the outbreak of racial riots in all of the major cities that African Americans migrated to, there would be a whole spate of racial riots right after World War I. There was the Tulsa Massacre in the early 20s. Then you had two big riots in the 40s, one in Harlem, one in Detroit, and a whole wave of riots right after World War I. And then, of course, the riots of the 60s. And you would see African-American businesses, especially in the case of Tulsa, being burned to the ground, their homes sometimes being bombed if they attempted to purchase a home in a white neighborhood or a mixed neighborhood. But despite all of this, the data shows that even with all of these challenges, those Black migrants that came out of the South, they were able to prosper as they moved into the North and the Midwest. In fact, one of the interesting things about this first migration is that those Black migrants actually did better than the Blacks who were born in the North. When you look at their income, when you look at their family stability, when you look at their poverty rates, on every indication they did better. They had more two-parent families, less divorce, less children being placed in institutions. They had more full-time employment for longer periods of their life, and their incomes were greater than the northern-born African Americans. And so when I look back at this as a Christian historian, I believe that God was showering some blessings on these people who had fled the violence and desperation of the South. And he was basically pouring down some blessings on them. And these blessings continued into the second generation. Even the generation that was born to those migrants, people who have Southern roots but were not born in the South, but their parents were part of that great migration, they also continued to experience upward mobility. But then once you got into the 60s and 70s, that was a difficult time for any of the Americans that were dependent, especially on factory work. Deindustrialization set in. The factory jobs began to leave the cities. First, many of them left the cities and went to the suburbs. The cities between the 1960s and 1970s lost close to 1 million factory jobs, while the suburbs gained 2.1 million jobs. And because of redlining, African Americans were unable to get access to the suburbs to follow those jobs. So many African Americans, despite experiencing some economic stability in the 30s, 40s, and 50s, by the 60s, most Black people were struggling. In addition to deindustrialization taking a lot of those good paying factory jobs away, you would see that the federal government was no longer investing in the cities, and many of the cities just really began to look shabby as they deteriorated. Roads were not being repaired, buildings were not being kept up. As unemployment set in, more and more businesses left the cities and moved to the suburbs. And that meant that the city was not collecting enough taxes to operate things like city hospitals, fire departments, police departments, school budgets. And in all the major cities, urban life really went downhill in the 60s and 70s. What you begin to see as the standard of living deteriorates, especially sharply in the 70s, we enter the next wave of the Great Migration. And it's literally a reversal of the Great Migration. Instead of African Americans continuing to leave the southern states and go to the north, the Midwest, and even to the west, now you begin to see this return to the southern states. And what's interesting about this return, it wasn't just simply Black folks who had Southern roots that decided to go home. What we know about this return migration is that fully half of these people were not initially Southerners. Some of them are Caribbean backgrounds, some of them had been Northerners going back many generations, but there was this move to the South. Now, where are many of the African Americans going? They're going to these high growth southern states. And there are certain southern states that have become hotspots in this great migration more than others. And one of the things that's going on is that after World War II, when the United States went into the Cold War and was building up its military, the federal government was building a lot of military bases, and most of these military bases were in the South, or what they call the Sun Belt, the South plus the Southwest. Not only did you have the building of the military bases in the South, but anywhere you had these military bases, you needed all of the supplies that the U.S. Branches of the military are relied on. You need all of your petrochemical plants, your petroleum. You needed all of the manufacturing and engineering of all of the supplies that the military forces use. You needed the development of new technology for the military. You needed aeronautics. You also needed a lot of the natural resources that the South was very rich in. There was oil in Texas, there was bauxite, there was aluminum. And this is why the federal government built so many of those military bases in the areas that had those natural resources that the military needed. So wherever these military bases were built, it attracted industry because all of these support industries were needed to support the expansion of the Army and the Marines and the Navy and so forth. This also meant that with the building of these military bases, it increased the number of federal jobs in these states that had military bases. Sometimes 1 out of every 4 workers was a federal worker. So this meant that from World War II on, the place where high-paying, stable jobs was being created was now in the South or in the Southwest. So once things began to deteriorate in the northern and Midwestern cities, by the 1960s, 1970s, African Americans began to pack up their bags and just head down to the South where the opportunities were. What's interesting about this return migration is who is leaving. And I want to talk about that a great deal because this makes this return migration very different than the migrations that preceded it. And now we're going to go on to our third map, which is going to give us an idea of where people are going. And the green circles are showing you the hot spots in the South that are gaining the most African American migrants. And of course, these are the cities that we hear mentioned all the time: Atlanta, Dallas, Houston, Charlotte. You know, every time we talk to someone who's moving south, we before they finish the sentence, we can almost guess which one of these cities, because we hear these cities. Well, if they're going to the Southwest, it's probably over to Phoenix. And there's a reason. Or Raleigh is another hot spot. And there's a reason, is because this is where the professional jobs, the white collar jobs, these are jobs that pay well. They're jobs that also require education and skills. And so what's going on is that the availability of these well-paying jobs, it is creating a brain drain on the Black communities in the North and the Midwest, because the majority of the people who are migrating are college educated Blacks.
Mhm.
And what is very distinct about this pattern is that more than half of these migrants, and it's increasing, are female. And this is a historic difference than the first migration. The first migration, when Blacks were leaving the South and coming up North, that didn't create a gender imbalance. But this migration is definitely headed in that direction. So, as we talk about African Americans heading to the South, and we'll go to our next map now so we can kind of see what this means in terms of just shifts in population. This is a bar chart just showing you how the Black population in Chicago and Atlanta have changed in a 50-year period. Um, the orange is for Atlanta. And as you can see, if you look at 1970, you see how short the orange bar is. And then by the time you go to 2020, you can see how much it's grown. The blue bar is Chicago. Chicago used to hold the second largest Black population in the United States, second
Mhm.
only to New York City. And now Atlanta has surpassed Chicago. Every time I talk to a Black person and they tell me they're moving, I said, "Are
Mhm.
you going to Atlanta?" And usually, my guess is usually right. Okay, and so it now is 40% greater than Chicago's Black population.
Mhm.
And what we find is most of the African Americans that are moving to the South, they're moving not into the central cities. They are moving into the never ending number of suburban rings that are around the central cities. So if you go down to Atlanta, what you will find is one set of suburbs after another, all circling the city. And people may work in the city, but then they return home to their suburbs. So
Mhm.
another shift is occurring as this return migration is underway, and that is the number of or percentage of Blacks that live in the suburbs. In the 1960s, 1970s, you had the majority of African Americans, they became urban people. And they were not allowed basically to move out to the suburbs because of redlining. However,
Mhm.
with this reverse migration that's going on, this return to the South, we see that now 54% of all Black Americans in the United States in the year 2020 are now suburbanites.
Mhm.
And where is suburbanization growing the fast? It's growing the fastest in the South. And what's interesting about these southern suburbs, um, the southern suburbs are not only containing more and more African Americans and Latinos, but they also are becoming a little bit more diverse. Now, the region that has become the most diverse in its suburbs is the West, and that's why California is such a lure for young folks,
Yeah.
because that's really where residential segregation has seriously declined in California. However, the South, in these hot spots, these growth areas like Houston and Dallas and Charlotte and Raleigh and Atlanta, we also begin to see more diverse suburbs developing there as well. Sadly, the region that has not budged in terms of its level of racial segregation, Blacks live one place, whites live another, is
Mhm.
the North and the Midwest. The North is just as segregated as it was 50 years ago.
Wow.
Yeah. So we're seeing some changes in some areas, but not all across the board. So I want to raise some questions about What does all of this mean? On the one hand, we might celebrate this new reverse migration because, of course, we want to see our people do better. We want to see them get access to opportunities. We want to see them prosper, right? That's in the word of God that we should prosper.
Mhm.
We want to see our children grow up in stable families. We don't want to see people living in poverty and so forth. And yet, when we think about what is happening to the class structure of African Americans in the 21st century, the pattern of this migration shows us that there are some uncomfortable patterns that are starting to develop. It appears that African Americans who are moving south are experiencing greater economic mobility, not only of the people they left behind, but of the Southern Blacks who were born there.
Mm.
And it raises questions whether or not there's going to be some tensions between homegrown Southerners and these new migrants that are now moving in from northern states, taking the best jobs.
Wow.
The second thing, as the African Americans who move to the South are getting better jobs, it's the more educated people, most of them, who are going to the South. Are we going to see a Black America that is more regionally divided by class and education, with the poorer and more uneducated Blacks in the North and the more prosperous and educated Blacks in the South?
Mm.
That's an incredible reversal of Black history when you think about the whole legacy of slavery. Uh,
Yeah.
but it also raises some questions about how stable will our northern communities remain. When we look at things like poverty rates, will we move to an era in which northern and midwestern Black communities are more impoverished, that their children don't have as much opportunity, that their schools are not as well funded
Mm.
because the economies are not as strong? And also, what will happen to family formation in the North and the Midwest as more and more females leave the South?
Mm.
When you get a gender imbalance, young people do not find mates to form families. So these are all questions that we're going to have to see how this plays out as this migration continues. On the flip side, we know that the first wave of the Great Migration was met with a lot of violence. I mentioned this earlier, how race
Mm.
riots erupted in all the cities when Black Southerners started migrating around World War One. Are we going to see the same thing in the South as African Americans start moving into Dallas and Houston and Atlanta and so forth? Will we see a tightening up of housing policies in efforts to reestablish segregation in the South? We've already started to see challenges to African American voting in the state of Georgia, with one law after another being passed to restrict African Americans from
Mm.
exercising their vote. And we're already starting to see an escalation in police violence. I took a look at maps that show how police violence has escalated by state, and three of the top states where the police kill most civilians and African Americans are killed by the police three times more than white Americans are Texas, Georgia, and North Carolina. These
Wow.
same states that so many migrants are headed to.
Mm.
So when I look at this new great migration, I have mixed feelings. On the one hand, I'm happy that people are finding opportunities. I'm happy that people, if they want to live in the suburbs, can find suburbs, they can find stable schools. On the other hand, when I look at the big picture, what is this going to mean regionally? And are we going to see a repeat of some of the downside of migration, the backlash, the racism that tends
Mm.
to flare up anytime African Americans are prospering? Because that's what the Tulsa massacre was all about. It was
Mm.
about trying to wipe out the Black middle class in Tulsa. And so I am hoping and praying that this migration will break with that historical pattern, and that our people will be able to pursue their destinies and prosper without instant replay of some of the negative patterns of the past. And that is my presentation now.
That is so good. I mean, it's so interesting. My two of my sons, migrated to California.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Andre's in Santa Clarita and Antoine's in, oh, where is he at? I can't even remember, but he's like an hour away from, where is he at? I can't even think I forget. But he's like an hour away from Santa Clarita,
Mm-hmm.
to where he is, and that broke my heart even more.
Imagine.
And then Crystal, she had went to Washington D.C. She
Mm-hmm.
was there for a couple of years, and now she's back here in Albany, and I thank God. Oh, I thank God for that. Oh my goodness. And then Sean, he keeps talking about he wants to move to North Carolina.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, North Carolina. I was down there 2 years ago, and
Mhm.
I was speaking to some people because I asked them. I said, how are you all doing with? Because it was one of the fastest growing states in the year I was there, and one of the things that people talked about, they said, you know, when they built the city of Charlotte, they never designed it for the amount of traffic, and they said
Mm.
now they said you would think that you're in Manhattan trying to
Wow.
get around. The traffic is that people get off of work and they sit in traffic. It's like being in LA and you
Mm.
just sit,
Right.
because they can't even accommodate and the population
Mhm.
is just still growing. They just keep building. They just
That's
keep.
just like you said, like LA, they
Mhm,
talk Andre talks
mhm.
about how the traffic is. Antoine's in Anaheim.
Anaheim.
Anaheim, yeah. Yeah. They talk about how the traffic and, how crowded it is and everything, so
Yeah. I've been to Los Angeles, and I was born in Brooklyn. I couldn't live there. I mean, the traffic is crazy. It really, you could
yeah.
lose a good part of your lifetime just sitting in traffic. That's how long it takes people to get home from work. You know,
Wow.
yeah, it's
Wow.
incredible. You know,
Mhm.
but I'm kind of holding my breath on this great migration. I have
Mhm.
mixed feelings about it. A part of me is happy. I know people who have moved south, and they're ecstatic. They love the quality of life. But
Yeah.
when I look at the big picture, I kind of wonder, what is this going to mean? What is this going to mean for us as a people?
Mm.
As a people, is it good for us to have folks who have had less education, less opportunity, just kind of like left behind, you
Mm.
know? And what's going to happen to them? You know what I mean?
Right. Right.
So, I'm hoping that we get a little more balance in how things
Mhm.
get played out.
And it's in I know in Los Angeles or California, the isn't it so much more expensive
Yeah.
to live there? I
Oh yeah.
mean,
And in fact, when I was doing the some of the readings for this presentation, one of the things that the scholars who have been tracking the migration have shown, California for a while was receiving, like in the 1990s, was receiving a lot of African American migrants from like all over the place, not just from the
Mhm.
North and the Midwest. A lot of people going to California. But by the time they hit the year 2000, because housing was so unaffordable,
Mm.
to rent an apartment, everything is just, the cost of living is just too high. And the homelessness problem got very severe because people couldn't afford, rents and so forth.
Mm.
Now California is starting to lose. It's not a heavy loss, but it's a steady drip each year.
Mm.
More blacks are leaving the state than blacks are entering the state. So the
Mm.
net black population is definitely starting to go down. And where are they going? They're going to Texas.
Oh, wow.
Texas is drawing because of the jobs. Yeah,
Mhm.
because of the jobs. Atlanta is really mixed. Atlanta has a serious cultural arts scene, as you know. The music scene
Mhm.
in Atlanta is very very hot. There's lots of opportunities, and Atlanta has a lot more different industries that you can get involved in. Whereas in Texas, the oil industry is still the big bear, but they're still hiring people. They're still hiring
Mhm.
people, and those are good paying jobs. So people are going, but politics in Texas, it's you got to be careful down there.
Mm.
Got to be careful. Yeah,
Boy. Well,
yeah.
this has been really interesting, and I thank you for taking the time to be with me tonight. This
Pleasure.
has really been good. I wanted to do something for Black History Month.
Hmm.
Even though our history, like I said in the beginning, we're always making history every single day,
Oh
but the man wants us to have 1 month. I
yeah.
mean, yeah, 1 month out of a year, but we
Yeah.
know.
Yeah.
But I wanted to do something, to in commemoration of this month. And I appreciate you taking the time to be with me tonight. And I
Oh,
appreciate it so
I am so
much.
grateful to be here. You talk about memories. I was cleaning
Mm,
out a file drawer and I came across an old program from
mm,
SUNY. And this was when I was just getting started. I was still, I don't know, maybe 18, 19 years old. And you
mm.
brought the choir up to sing at the SUNY campus. I think I was what, a
Oh,
sophomore? And that's when I first started doing my programming on campus, and it was for Black History Month. So
oh,
it's
wow.
very touching that here we are on a February again, so many years later.
I think I remember that
Yeah,
too. I do remember that.
yeah, yeah, yeah,
Wow.
yeah. And they're still doing the Dr. Martin Luther King luncheon up there on an annual basis, which I'm
Oh,
so proud of. Yeah. And you brought the choir up for that too the first time we did it. So
yeah.
yeah, I remember that. Yeah, that we go back quite a ways, quite a ways, and it's all
So
good.
there's something good.
Well, I'm
Very
glad that we
good.
worked out the technical difficulty here. It's been
Yes.
a pleasure. Yeah.
I was beginning to wonder. And then when I went live and then you weren't there and I said, "Oh no, what am I gonna do now?"
Well, I made
But
sure when I reconnected, I said a prayer this time. So I just thank the Lord for hearing that prayer, and whatever
yeah.
was going on with the connection, it took care of itself. So, yeah.
Well,
Okay.
I thank God for you, being here tonight, and, I pray that we can connect more, go out to lunch, do something.
Yes,
Um,
definitely. We'll
yeah,
definitely make that happen and not let so much
yeah,
time go by. You know.
yeah, it's
But it
been
was an
good.
honor and a pleasure to be here. And I just pray that everything goes well with the
Mhm,
outreach that you're doing through the ministry in honor
yeah,
of your mom. Your mom was always so gracious towards me. She was
mhm,
one of the warmest people, um,
yeah,
and such just a faithful servant of the Lord.
yes,
Yeah, you
yes, she
know.
was.
So yeah, it's wonderful
Mm,
that this is being done in her name.
yeah,
Okay.
so
All right.
thank you,
You're
and,
welcome.
my closing prayer and scripture for each one of you, and I'm going to read it off of here, and it's from Romans 15:5 and 6, which says, "May the God of endurance and encouragement grant you to live in such harmony with one another in accord with Christ Jesus, that together you may, with one voice, glorify the God and Father of your Lord Jesus Christ. And may the blessings of the good Lord be richly upon each one of you." Risa, don't go anywhere.
Okay.
Be blessed.